I found my signature where it had no business being. It was a morning like any other. The kettle side on the stove. I opened the mailbox and thumbed a stack of envelopes. Tucked into a realtor's packet was a document with my name written in ink. I knew that loop in the H, the small tilt to my Y. I had written my name on checks and notes for 50 years. This looked like mine, but it was not supposed to be there. My chest dropped. The air in the kitchen tasted thin. The radio talked about the weather without knowing anything had shifted. I stood at the dented table where Arthur used to set his mug and smoothed the paper with 2 careful fingers. A simple line of ink felt like a question. Who would sign my name without asking? Did they think I would not notice? Did they think my life could be rearranged with a pen stroke? I held the page and felt a small, hot betrayal. But that wasn't the worst part. My hands trembled as memory and anger crowded together silently. I stared at the ink, and the house suddenly felt full of questions. Hello, my dear. Come sit with me at the kitchen table. Today we're talking about trust, small betrayals, and how to stand up without shouting. I want to tell you everything the moment I found the paper, what I did next, and the small steps that can protect your dignity. If you like these stories, please subscribe and leave a comment. Your words make this little kitchen feel less lonely and help others feel brave. Share the video with someone who needs permission to ask questions and to insist on being seen. I will speak plainly and offer practical steps. Ask for paper. Bring a witness. Set a timeline. There will be moments that make your throat tight and moments that make you breathe easier. Stay with me. I promise to be honest and kind. Stay with me. I'll tell you how a single signature changed everything today. The kettle sighed and I checked the mailbox. Like always, mornings are slower now. I move through them like a small ceremony. Coffee beans, 2 scoops, the old radio playing something soft, usually gospel, or the local weather. My hands remember the rhythm before I even think about it. Cup, spoon, sugar, stir. The light in the kitchen lands on the same places every day. The chipped tile near the sink, the dent in the table where Arthur dropped his toolbox one summer, the picture frame slightly crooked because I keep forgetting to fix it. Little flaws, each one familiar, each one mine. I live alone, but the house hums like it knows how to keep me company. The porch light still hums faintly even when it's turned off. It's an old habit from my mother. Keep it on for whoever's coming home late, even if there's no one left to come. Most days, I sort the mail at the counter before the coffee's even cooled. There's comfort in the pattern envelopes, small notes, grocery flyers. Most of them mean nothing, but the act feels like proof of being part of something. Bills remind you you're still on the map. That morning was no different, at least, not at first. The air smelled faintly of rain and toast. I opened the door and reached into the metal box. There were 4 envelopes and 1 thicker packet, folded tight, and if my name was printed neatly on the front, Evelyn M. Hart. I smiled a little at the middle initial only. My bank used that up. Carried the stack back inside and laid it down beside my mug. The paper looked new against the age of the table. I took my time, opening letters in order of importance. Gas bill, catalog, something about community taxes. Then I slid the thick one from the pile. The flap was crisp, the paper heavy, not like regular mail. I told myself it was probably another notice, maybe about the house appraisal or a mortgage ad. Still, I felt a small flutter, the kind you get when something looks out of place in a life built on routine. I reached for my letter, Openia Bras one Arthur had given me for our 10th anniversary, and sliced through the top carefully. Inside were 2 pages and a carbon copy beneath them. I pulled them free and unfolded them. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The words were all in the right order. Formal, polite, something about authorization, joint access, a small property adjustment. But then, my eyes fell to the bottom. My name was there, in ink. It wasn't a typed version. It was written. My signature. Only it wasn't. I leaned closer. My heart did a strange, uneven thing. I knew that shape, the little upward hook on the H, the curve of the T crossing like a bird in flight. I'd made that loop thousands of times on checks, on Christmas cards, on permission slips, when my boy was small. But this one felt colder, practiced, like someone trying to imitate warmth. I set my coffee down slowly. The radio kept talking about the weekend rain, cheerful, unaware. The signature looked like mine in every visible way, except that I didn't remember signing. Not this, not anything like it. I ran my thumb over the ink. It didn't smudge. It had been dry for days, weeks, maybe. My breath came short. There was a line above it, too dated, witnessed. All official. My kitchen felt suddenly too bright. The kettle clicked as it cooled, and I thought, absurdly, of the pen I keep in the drawer by the fridge. Black ink, medium tip. Would someone have used it? Would they have come here? Or had they traced an old form, copied something, made me into paperwork? I walked to the mantel. The house creaked under my feet, that same slow rhythm it's always had. From the window, I could see the porch where the wind had knocked down last autumn's chime. The ordinary felt sharper, like a photograph in higher contrast. I don't know how long I stood there staring at that paper. It wasn't about money, not yet, anyway. It was about the idea that someone thought they could put my name where I hadn't been. Someone thought they could take the shorthand of my life, my handwriting, my trust, and use it without asking. That was the first betrayal. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst was the quiet, the knowing that the answer to who might not come easily. I folded the page again and placed it on the mantel, where Arthur's photo sits. He's smiling in that old Polaroid, sun in his eyes, shirt sleeves rolled up. He always said, "Your name is your line in the sand. Evie, don't let anyone drag it for you." I smiled a little, though my throat felt tight. When I turned back toward the table, I noticed something small I'd missed before. The envelope wasn't handwritten, it was printed, block letters, perfectly straight, perfectly impersonal, not the kind of writing someone uses for love or care. I stared at those capital letters like they might tell me who had sent it, what they were thinking. But the letters only sat there, quiet and smug on the paper, refusing to say a word. The envelope was addressed in block script. I hardly recognized that. My mother taught me that a written name is a small, serious vow. She said it at the kitchen table, dipping her pen into a bottle of blue-black ink. Her handwriting leaned like the slope of a hill, steady, deliberate. "You don't rush your name, Evelyn," she told me. "It's not just letters, it's your promise in ink." I was maybe 9, practicing loops and crosses on brown paper grocery bags she'd flattened with her hand. My father sat by the window, reading the newspaper aloud between bites of toast. Every word in our house seemed to carry weight back then. You didn't waste them then those days. Neighbors borrowed sugar and brought back cash. Folks shook hands instead of signing contracts. But when you did sign something, it meant something. You might as well have sworn an oath. That lesson followed me like a small compass. When I married Arthur, we signed our names on the church register in fountain pen. He wrote his slowly, his thumbs smudging the bottom of the T. I remember how his brow furrowed. He wasn't a fancy man, but he treated that signature like a promise he intended to keep. "Marriage is a kind of document," he'd said later. "You keep adding to it with every choice you make." We kept that promise through moves, jobs, children, and all the unremarkable miracles of middle life. Every mortgage, every car loan, every little school form we signed together. Sometimes on the hood of a car, sometimes leaning against a porch rail. Sometimes in the kitchen with the kids giggling over our shoulders. My son learned his name at that same table. He was left-handed, and the pen smeared. I told him not to worry. Signatures don't have to be perfect. They just have to be true. "Write it like you mean it," I'd say, and he'd grin, tongue between his teeth, drawing careful loops. He grew up fast, got good at paperwork before I ever needed to be. I used to joke that he knew how to fill out insurance forms before he knew how to cook, but I was proud of that. It meant he could handle life's finer print. When you raise a child with trust, you assume they'll always know where the line is between help and harm, between doing something for you and doing something to you, and yet, sometimes love gets mixed up with justification. The thing about a name, especially when it's written, is that it can travel farther than you do. It can show up where you've never been, attached to things you never agreed to. I thought about that all morning after I found that forged paper. My name looked right, but my gut told me it wasn't mine. It felt like hearing your own voice on a tape recorder. It's you, but not the way you remember. I made another cup of coffee and sat in the chair by the window. Outside, a robin hopped along the fence. The day looked calm, but inside my chest, something restless had started to move. I thought of my mother again, steady as she was, her pen making careful marks. I thought of the candle she used to light when my father worked late, a little flame that meant, "I trust you to come home." All those small symbols of faith, the light, the name, the shared key, they all meant the same thing. "I believe you'll keep your word," and that's what made what happened next so hard to bear. I'd taught my son to sign his name carefully. Now my own looked betrayed. We built a life on small promises, and sometimes they stopped being spoken. Arthur and I built ours: one job, one payment, one kindness at a time. We weren't flashy. We didn't chase big things, but we showed up. That was our language for love. The rhythm of our marriage was steady Sunday church, Wednesday groceries, Friday night supper at the diner with the same waitress who knew our order. We raised our son in that rhythm. When we helped a neighbor, it was without keeping score. When someone borrowed our mower, we said, "Keep it till next rain." There was trust baked into everything, like yeast in bread. And yet, over the years, that trust began to stretch. People stop saying thank you after a while. They start assuming. You lend, they take, you offer, they ask again, you say yes. And soon, it's expected. That's how quiet fault lines form in the space between gratitude and habit. After Arthur passed, I kept the same house, the same routines. My son helped with the bigger things, taxes, paperwork, online forms I never learned to use. I was grateful. But slowly, the help became invisible. Bills got rerouted. Notifications came by email instead of post. I told myself it was progress. Still, some part of me missed holding the paper myself, missed the sound of envelopes in the slot, my own hand signing checks. Maybe that's when the first fracture began, when I let convenience replace clarity. Looking back, I can see it. The soft edge of assumption where we stop explaining ourselves to each other. I trusted the people I loved to handle what I no longer wanted to. I told myself, you've earned some rest. But rest is only peaceful when it's mutual. And sometimes, love becomes a kind of shortcut people take without asking directions. Now, as I stood at the mantel, that folded paper in front of me, I felt the distance between what used to be mine and what had quietly been borrowed. The paper wasn't loud, it didn't threaten or accuse, it just sat there, symptom of a slow shift, years in the making. I stared at it, feeling the weight of every quiet yes I'd given that turned into assumption. A folded paper on the mantel made a private fault line visible. It was one thing to find the paper. It was another to read the words and feel the floor tilt a little beneath me. My name was there, clear as if I'd written it myself. The kind of clarity you get when you've practiced a flourish for decades, that little curl on the HMI signature's fingerprint. But the page said things I had never agreed to. I called my son. My voice was steadier than I felt. "Did you send this?" I asked. He cleared his throat on the other end. "Mom," he said, "there's a lot you don't know. I can explain." His sentence was soft as a bandage and already had the promise of fixing built into it. But the bandage doesn't heal the cut. It covers it. He arrived within the hour. He walked in like someone stepping into an old photograph. Familiar, a little rumpled. He hugged me first, and I let him. We sat at the table, the same table that had heard preschool stories and college worries. I put the paper between us like an open wound. He spoke in practicalities. "We had to hurry," he said. "They called about the inspection. I thought it would be easier if I handled it." Hands that used to reach for my hand to steady me now reached for forms. "I signed some things to get it started," he said, voice low. I was trying to keep things from getting worse. He looked tired, and it made me softer for a moment. But softness doesn't erase the shape of a wrong. "You signed my name," I said. I don't know why the question sounded like a small animal that needed protecting. He met my eyes, and I saw the way his shoulders had begun to carry a different kind of burden, kind that makes you into a manager of other people's crises. He offered explanations that seemed sensible. Miscommunication with a notary, a rushed call, someone on the other end misunderstanding who had authority. Each explanation was like a patch on a leaky roof. It might hold for a night, but eventually the rain finds a seam. Neighbors began to notice something had shifted. A woman I'd known since my son was small came by and said, "Is everything all right, Evelyn?" In that way that's supposed to be kind but sometimes smells of speculation. Word spreads in small towns, like rings on a pond, gentle at first, then widening. My son kept repeating, "I can explain." The phrase felt like the first crack in a plate. When someone says they can explain, they're already dividing the world into what is acceptable and what is not. I found myself wanting to believe him, wanting to trust the boy who once let me braid his hair. But trust is not the same as ignoring a document that carries your name into decisions you didn't make. That night I sat with the paper and the radio on low, like a friend pretending not to hear the news. There was a small, stubborn knot in my throat. The house that had always welcomed me suddenly felt like it contained a stranger with my handwriting. The kettle hissed as if trying to remind me of the ordinary. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was not merely the ink. It was the thought that my name, my small covenant, could be used without asking. The idea that someone could place my line in the sand and not bother to tell me. It made me feel like a guest in the life I had built. My son said quietly, "I can explain." And I heard the first crack. They answered like people trying to keep a leaking tub from spilling. Their explanations were tidy but never quite matched the paper. At first it sounded plausible. "It was a draft," his wife said, smoothing the paper between her fingers. "We thought it was preliminary. We never meant to file it." She looked like someone who'd tried to hold too many plates at once. But the document wasn't a draft. The invoice from the county arrived the next morning, stamped and serious. There were dates on the form that placed the signature weeks before we found it. Details began to multiply. Each one felt like a small nail driven into an already fragile plank. I went to the bank. I asked to see my account records. A polite man with a badge shuffled pages and told me the story of transfers and pending approvals. The bank used the word authorization. Authorization sounds formal and necessary, until you realize it might mean that someone decided for you. They pointed to a file. There was my name again, and this time it had been translated into numbers. I walked home feeling smaller. I had always prided myself on being careful. I paid our taxes on time. I saved for repairs, clipped coupons when necessary. I wasn't naive. But the mechanics of Itime, scanned forms, what people call the messy middle of modern life, had become a place where someone could slip things past you if you didn't watch it. The neighbors began to ask questions in low voices. Mrs. Dalton stopped by with pie and said, "I heard something on the phone late that week. Was that them?" Her fingers trembled as she wrapped the pie in wax paper. She didn't want to pry. She was simply reporting a tone, a worried woman on the line, a man speaking quickly, voices that suggest hurry and decision. There's a difference between hearing and understanding. And sometimes the only witness you have is a neighbor's recall. I felt the pressure of community curiosity. People mean well, mostly, but they carry gossip like other people carry grocery bags. They're full of both nourishment and fruit that bruises easily. At home, I tried to separate the facts from the feelings. I made lists: who had keys, who'd been in the house recently, who had access to my mail. Small practical questions that suddenly mattered more than they had a week before. My son repeated a different version each time, some more plausible than others. Sometimes I thought he had been hurried by goodness trying to prevent a worse outcome. Other times I felt the chill of being rearranged, like furniture, by someone who assumed the room was theirs to edit. There were conversations that left me raw. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked once, voice too small. He said the silence had been because he did not want to worry me. The old explanation, "don't trouble the parent," felt both kind and patronizing. I am 73. I wanted to tell him, "I can manage the trouble," but I didn't say it then. The truth was hanging like fog in the kitchen. I could feel it fill corners and make the room no longer comfortable. I wrapped my hands around the mug until the warmth steadied me. The practicalities of trust were now loud and invasive. Paper had become a weapon and an excuse. A neighbor mentioned hearing a nighttime phone call the week before. The bank's letter felt like a cold hand on the back of my neck. It came the next morning. Official envelope stamped with a deadline. The language was polite and exact. It asked for confirmation of authorization and warned of default procedures if we did not respond. Deadlines are cruel because they make decisions for you. I called the bank again, and the clerk's voice was careful. "Sometimes clerical errors happen," she said. Clerical error. The words sounded small enough to soothe, until you realize a clerical error can cost a house. She promised to flag it and to contact the department that handled adjustments. "We'll look into it," she said. It sounded reasonable, but reasonable doesn't always mean sufficient. A realtor's brochure landed in my lap a day later. Someone had inquired about potential buyers just to gauge interest. They said my name had appeared in more than one place. The practical reality of handling property is that people move numbers and names, like cards across a table, and sometimes forget the human face behind the cards. I began to feel both violated and foolish. How had I been so unaware? Did I miss a call? Was there a meeting I had forgotten? The mind can spiral in a dozen small directions, each one a rodent of worry. At the same time, I didn't want to make accusations that might break a family. Who wants to be the matriarch who starts litigating over a signature? My instinct is to hold the family together. It is also why this felt so corrosive. The thing that protects a family privacy, deference, not making a fuskin be the very mechanism by which someone is removed. We had to respond. There was no choice. Paper and deadlines do not wait for good intentions. I asked for copies of everything. I insisted that no further action be taken without my explicit consent. My son agreed. He sounded relieved and promised to help get the paperwork straight. He promised, and I wanted to believe him. But promises made under pressure are thin things. I felt the timeline pressing. When there's a deadline, people make shortcuts. They rationalize, saying, "We can always fix it later." When later becomes a story of grief, you realize later is not a friend. That night the house felt loud and small, as if the walls leaned in. I lay awake thinking about paper and signatures, and the ways modern life can sewer an old sense of decency. I had trusted people to handle what I could not. Now trust was the question. They suggested it was a clerical error, but then the deadline arrived. Evidence is a patient thing. It does not shout. It shows up as small misfits, little things lined up like clues. An email timestamp that placed authorizations a day earlier than I thought possible, a misfiled receipt that showed a signature block filled in handwriting I did not recognize at first glance, an appointment confirmation that listed my name, and a note in the comments that said handled by J. I began to collect these pieces, as if I were making a mosaic of what happened. Each tile was small, and each alone might be dismissed, but together they made a picture I could no longer ignore. My son's explanations shifted like weather. Sometimes it was a misunderstanding, sometimes it was a rush, sometimes he said he'd meant to tell me but forgot. I sat with the mediator one afternoon, a woman from church with steady hands and the look of someone who had heard too many family storms to be surprised by any of them. She asked me to read the messages aloud. There was an email from a notary, document attached for signature. The timestamp was late at night. That made me slow. Later. I opened my phone and scrolled. There it was, a message with no name attached, no signature, but a plain phrase, "Done." It's sorted, no context, no author. I felt the hair on my arms lift. It was like seeing a footprint in wet cement. You know someone has passed that way. That anonymous text was small and cruel. It suggested competence and completion but left out consent. Whoever had sent it was telling the world a job had been completed. They didn't care who owned the name beneath it. There's a peculiar cruelty in invisible labor when someone makes decisions and never looks at who bears the consequences. Neighbors had started to take sides quietly. A woman I'd once volunteered with at the soup kitchen hinted that sometimes children do things out of love, and sometimes out of panic. Another neighbor muttered, "I wouldn't sign for anyone." The community lens caught odd angles of our family glare. My son's behavior grew more erratic under the pressure. He'd call and be apologetic, then defensive, then exhausted. His wife avoided long conversations. The household had shifted from a place of shared laughter to one of hushed meetings and lists. The children, my grandchildren, weren't as free with hugs as they used to be. You can feel when the air in a home has been rearranged. I kept going through the documents and the timestamps, as if a pattern would appear and explain it all away. But the pattern only suggested intent. There's a difference between a mistake and a choice. A mistake stings and is fixed. A choice suggests agency, and when agency is used to move your life without your say, it becomes betrayal. I found myself curled up with notes like a detective and a widow both. My son had tried to protect something, or perhaps he'd tried to make a calculation. The facts leaned one way, the heart leaned another. And then, one day, an unsigned text on my phone read, "Done." It's sorted. Pressure does strange things to people. When you are told there is no time, your brain moves from thoughtfulness to survival. They said there wasn't time, and time can be the enemy of truth. Deadlines create a force field that bends ethics into I learned that the hard way. They came to me with an ultimatum dressed as urgent care. "If we don't get this signed by tomorrow, we could lose the window," my son said, voice thin with worry. "The buyer is ready. The inspector is booked. We'll miss the rate." Somewhere between love and ledger, they'd put a clock. I looked at their faces and saw fatigue, real fatigue. It made me ache for them. I also saw the way hurry makes decisions feel inevitable. Do it now and worry later. But worry later can be a way of letting others decide your life for you. "You want me to sign this?" I asked. My hand hovered over the paperwork like a bird over a nest. The pen felt heavier than it had in the morning. When I thought about putting ink to line, I imagined not only the signature but the life that would be governed by it. They tried to make it sound simple. "You're always so generous," his wife said. "This is just helping us move things along." Generosity is a virtue until it becomes a burden you carry alone. There's a difference between opening your door and being moved out while the door is still warm. My neighbors came to me in small groups, offering advice like soup. Mrs. Dalton said quietly, "Ask for time, ask for copies." A man from church tapped his watch and said, "You don't want to be rushed." Practical voices that, for once, agreed with the anxieties in my chest. I asked for a pause. "Let us call the lawyer," I said. "Let us get copies. Let us make sure this was done with my consent." They looked disappointed and a little angry. "We don't have that much time," my son said. It sounded like pleading. "Please, Mom, sign it and we'll sort the rest." They were asking me to trust their haste. I thought of Arthur's hands on the fence. I thought of my mother's handwriting lessons. I thought of the small vow a signature had been for me, an anchor. To sign was to say yes in a way that a spoken yes cannot always be, but to trust a hurried plea felt like stepping off a cliff with someone else, promising there was soft ground below. I had been hurt already. I didn't want to be hurt again because I'd been kind. They asked me to sign in the next 24 hours. Held the pen in my fingers, as if it were a small, sharp thing. It came from the most ordinary place on envelope that had been slid under the mat at my door. No return address, no note, just a thin folder with a single printed email inside. I thought it was junk mail until I saw my name in the subject line. The email was between my son and a mortgage officer. It was dated 3 weeks before the day I found that forged signature. He'd written, "Will use my mother's authorization for this. She wants the place safe and secure." The officer had replied, "Understood, I'll file it once the form is completed." The line between authorization and agreement is a narrow one. And there it was, my son walking it like a man trying to balance over water. I felt the ache before the anger. He wasn't stealing from me. He wasn't trying to cheat me. He was trying to solve a problem with my name. They were behind on payments. A medical bill had come due for one of the grandkids. The roof needed repair, and the second job he'd taken hadn't worked out. I read the words and saw panic between the lines. Not malice, it broke my heart. There's something more painful than betrayal. It's pity for the person who betrays you. It makes your throat burn, because part of you still wants to protect them, even as you realize they've used your trust like a ladder to reach something they couldn't on their own. When I confronted him again, I didn't shout. I just held up the printout. He looked at it and said, softly, "Mom, I didn't know what else to do." And for a moment, I believed him, because I knew that tonette was the same tone he used when he broke my favorite mug as a boy and tried to glue it back together before. I found out. He said he wanted to keep me safe, that the paperwork was meant to protect me from foreclosure, that it was all part of managing things efficiently. Those were his words. Efficient, streamlined, protected. But protection without permission is just control dressed up nice. He said, "I was scared, Mom." And I believed that. There are moments in life when truth isn't a clean thing. It doesn't come like a bell ringing. It comes like a fog lifting just enough for you to see the outline of what's been hiding in plain sight. That morning, I saw it clearly. Fear had written my name on that paper. Fear for bills. Fear of failing. Fear that asking for help would sound like weakness. But fear doesn't excuse silence. And silence had built this entire mess. I sat with him in that kitchen where I'd once taught him to write his first name. He put his head in his hands. And for a while we were just two people who loved each other and had hurt each other without meaning to. But the tenderness didn't erase the damage. Love doesn't repair legal forms. Affection doesn't reverse authorization. And so I decided, if compassion had started this mess, then boundaries would have to end it. I would help, but on terms that didn't erase me. Knowing their reason made the hurt more complicated, not simpler. I sat down that night with a notepad and wrote a list, my kind of list, the kind my husband used to tease me for. Evie's lists could build a city, he'd say. This one had only 5 items. 1. Request full documentation for every account with my name on it. 2. Require witnesses for all signatures, no exceptions. 3. Set clear time limits for any help I give. 4. Keep copies of everything. 5. Remember that love does not mean unlimited access. It felt like armor made of paper. But sometimes, paper is all we have between fairness and loss. The next day, I called the local mediation center, the same folks who settle neighbor disputes and small estate issues. They knew me from church. I asked if they could help me reestablish my household boundaries. I remember the woman on the phone saying gently, "Good for you, Mrs. Hart. That's what we're here for." When I told my son, his face tightened. Mom, he said, you don't need to make this official. We can just talk. But just talking had already brought us here. Talking without record is how people rewrite history later. I told him, if we're doing this, we'll do it properly. With paper. He sighed, looked at the floor, and said, you don't trust us anymore. I said, I trust you enough to do this right. The daughter-in-law was less diplomatic. She called it dramatic. We're family, not business partners. I said, families can keep books, too. It's called fairness. The air in the room went cold. I realized in that moment that protecting yourself often looks like betrayal to people who benefit from your silence. It cost me ease. Dinners became shorter, phone calls more perfunctory. There's a loneliness in standing up for yourself when you've spent years being the peacemaker. But I would rather be lonely than erased. I would protect my name and my house, even if it angered people I loved. That night, a text came through from my daughter-in-law. We're worried you're being influenced by outsiders. Outsiders, she meant people who asked for accountability. Called my caution stubbornness that night. It felt like everyone had an opinion about my signature. At church, the pastor's wife squeezed my hand and said, we all go through seasons of misunderstanding. It sounded kind, but underneath it was a suggestion. Don't make waves. Another woman whispered, good for you, Evelyn. Some of us never got our names back. At the grocery store, people spoke in half sentences. I heard you're sorting things out. That must be hard. Gossip moves quietly in small towns. It's never cruel outright, but it leaves fingerprints. My son's in-laws stopped calling altogether. My neighbors started stopping by more often. One dropped off soup. Another left an article about elder rights. Compassion can be awkward when everyone sees your family cracks up close. Online, my granddaughter posted something vague. Families are complicated, but love wins. People commented hearts. I scrolled past it with a strange mix of pride and ache. Even love winning sometimes looks like losing ground. First. The mediation center called to confirm the meeting. I asked for one neutral witness from their office. I wanted it official.com, adult. My son agreed, though reluctantly. Let's just keep it civil, he said. Civility, I told him, is the least we can do. As the day approached, I found myself praying not for victory, but for clarity. I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition. I wanted my family to see that I wasn't fighting over property. I was fighting for the right to be consulted before my name traveled. That week was a blur of Kasparov's advice and side glances. People meant well, but meaning well doesn't stop your hands from shaking when you pick up the phone to confirm a meeting that might change everything. The night before the mediation, I made tea and sat by the window. The porch light hummed the way it always does, steady, low, comforting. I whispered, Arthur, give me strength to speak kindly and firmly. The house didn't answer, but the quiet steadied me. Tomorrow, we would sit at the table with witnesses present. There were nights I felt small and very alone. The kind of alone that makes the clock tick louder, like the house is keeping you company out of pity. I thought about walking away, selling what was mine before anyone else could sell it for me, starting over somewhere smaller, quieter, with nobody to sign on my behalf ever again. But at 73, the world outside your own porch light can feel like a test you no longer have the energy for. I missed Arthur most then. I missed the way he used to stand by the fence at dusk, looking at the horizon like it was something he could measure with his hands. He would have handled this differently, maybe calmer, maybe firmer, but he would have stood beside me. I found his pipe in the drawer one night, the one he'd quit years before he died. It still smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar. That smell reminded me who I was before fear made me cautious. I sat there, holding it, thinking, I am still that woman. I still have the right to be heard. On the kitchen counter, I'd made a list titled, What I Will Not Surrender. It was short. 1. My signature. 2. My home. 3. My peace. 4. My say in what bears my name. That list became a prayer of sorts. I read it before bed every night, and every morning, I added one more line of courage to the day, making a call, sending an email, documenting what used to be casual, each act a small reclamation. The pressure didn't fade, but the fear changed shape. It stopped being paralyzing and became a kind of push, like a tide nudging me toward something inevitable. One night, after another phone call that ended with raised voices and apologies, I packed a small bag, just in case, a few clothes, my documents, a photo of Arthur. I stood by the door, the envelope in my hand, car keys cold in my palm. Freedom sometimes looks like escape, but standing your ground takes more courage than running. I set the bag down, I almost walked out with one envelope and my car keys. The morning of the meeting, I wore my husband's watch. It was a small act of armor. The mediator, a woman named Teresa, arrived with a notebook and calm eyes. "We'll start slow," she said. My son and daughter-in-law came with files, charts, explanations. The air felt heavy, like a courtroom made of love and tension. I began simply. I chose respect for myself over being a convenient signature. The mediator nodded. My sons stared at the table. I told them what I wanted: clear ownership, written agreements, mutual access only with written consent, and regular reviews. No secret signings, no unilateral decisions. I didn't raise my voice. I just refused to lower it. There was crying, some apology, some defensiveness, but once words are on paper, they start to take shape. We scheduled follow-ups, signed corrected forms, and made a calendar for future check-ins. It wasn't triumph. It was survival. After they left, I sat in the quiet kitchen, exhausted but whole. The radio played an old song Arthur used to hum, and I smiled through the ache. Then the phone rang. It was my son. His voice was tired, sharp at the edges. "Mom," he said, "you didn't have to make it this hard." He called later that night and used words that cut. I said plainly, "My name is not a tool." The kitchen table held our history and our hard words. It had been the place of school lunches, scraped knees, and quiet forgiveness. Now it would hold the thing that decided whether we could repair what had been broken, that we gathered with the mediator and the papers, spread like maps. My son arrived first, hair a little uncombed, eyes tired. His wife sat with a stack of notes. The mediator set ground rules like a kind referee. "Speak your truth, one person at a time, no interruptions." I kept my hands on the warm cup of tea and let the words come steady. I told them what the paper had done to me. Not the financial panic, though, that was real, but the way someone had put my name into motion without asking. "My name is not a tool," I said. "It is my voice. Ask me before you use it." They answered with apologies and explanations. He said he had been scared. She said she thought she was protecting me. They listed worries: Bill's work, the roof. I listened and then asked for what I needed: corrected documents, notarized reversals, a clear calendar of decisions that would require my written consent, practical requests, not dramatic ones. The mediator moved us through it. We discussed reversals and corrections, who would pay for filings, and time. The conversation was messy and honest. I watched my son consider each item, the lines on his face shifting like weather. At moments he flinched at his own choices. At moments he softened into apology. Then he reached across and took my hand. It was small and human and imperfect. "Mom," he said, "I am sorry. It isn't a cure-all, but sometimes it is the start." We drafted a list of tangible steps, corrected paperwork, a notarized affidavit stating the signature was not provided by me, shared repair funds, and a calendar of check-ins. We signed a small memorandum that put our intentions on paper so they could no longer float as wishes. The act of writing things down changed the tone from argument to account. There were tears and practicalities. We agreed to freeze any action until the attorney had cleared the corrections. They promised to reimburse any fees incurred. The mediator wrote it in clear ink and photocopied it for all of us. We went through the documents line by line. The mediator read clauses aloud, while I followed with my finger. There was a sentence about authorization that felt like a trap. We circled it and decided to strike it. We talked about who would pay for filings, and whether any signatures could be verified by the notary. The process was slower than I would have liked. It was also necessary. At one point, the daughter-in-law broke down and explained the sequence of events: a frantic phone call from a clerk, the fear of losing a window of opportunity, the assumption that I would agree because I had often trusted them to help. She said, "It felt like triage, Mom. I thought I was doing the right thing." Her voice shook. I could hear the shame behind the words. My son admitted he had signed copies in a hurry, and had not told me because he thought it would worry me. He kept apologizing, and then explaining he wanted the problem solved. He was not thinking of consent. That admission landed like a heavy thing in the room. I had compassion for him. I also had to keep the conversation about fixing the damage, not just feelings. We set concrete steps. First, a notarized affidavit would be drafted to record that I did not sign this document knowingly. Second, the bank would be contacted and provided with the affidavit and an explanation for reversal. Third, any money moved or scheduled would be tracked and, if necessary, refunded. Fourth, a temporary joint account would be set up for shared expenses. with all deposits and withdrawals on the calendar. We each left the meeting with copies in hand. The mediator reminded us that accountability is a practice, not a single event. She told us to reconvene in 2 weeks to check progress. I drove home with the photocopy on my lap like a small flag of action. The house felt less like a stranger when I walked in, but the ache of betrayal still sat in my throat. But that wasn't the worst part. When night fell and the house quieted, I realized there were other papers I needed to check: hold deeds, wills, the safety deposit box key. I needed to ensure that my name, my life, and my small holdings were truly mine. It was work I should have done earlier, yes. But there is no shame in acting once you see the danger. I would not let the ease of others become the loss of my life. For a long moment, no one spoke. We put dates on the calendar, and I felt steadier. After the meeting, life did not become a fairy tale, but there were actions to point to. The attorney called and confirmed the freeze. The bank accepted the notice and paused any movement. The realtor's inquiry went quiet while we sorted the signatures. Those were small legal comforts, but comforts nonetheless. At home, we implemented simple rituals to keep the new agreements alive. The fridge calendar hung in plain sight. Each item had initials. Each repair fund deposit had a confirmation number that I could see. The daughter-in-law began calling before moving my things. My son texted updates about bill payments and job hunting. The weekly check-ins became a habit. 10 minutes each Sunday, to mark what needed attention and what would wait. I reclaimed ordinary acts: opening my own mail, calling my doctor, and making appointments, paying a bill that had been rerouted. The key on the little dish felt heavier in a good way. It was proof of access, not just to the house, but to decisions about it. Not everything went smoothly. Once a payment was missed. Once a box ended up at a donation center without notice. Each time we returned to paper and corrected the course. When tempers flared, we called the mediator. When someone forgot, a gentle reminder went on the calendar. We kept lists. I learned to log every call, every email, every confirmation number. The attorney advised that we get everything in writing and keep copies in a folder, labeled plainly, Evelyn Paper Trail. I bought a new accordion file and labeled tabs with dates and categories. The physical act of sorting the paperwork made a mess of the fear. It turned the abstract into manageable pieces. Friends helped me by coming over and sitting with me as I made calls. Mrs. Dalton drove me to 2 appointments and sat outside in her car when the waiting room felt too loud. She brought a thermos of coffee and a kind presence. That kind of help feels like treasure when the world seems determined to make you small. We also returned to small civility rituals that keep human bonds alive. My son would bring sandwiches when he came to file papers. His hands trembled sometimes, but he tried. The daughter-in-law started to ask before she moved my chair. Small courtesies are work. They are a muscle that needed exercise after being rusty. We wrote down expectations as if they were recipes. Who pays what percentage toward shared repairs, how long my help would extend. When we would revisit the agreement, calendars and receipts became proof that we meant what we said. The mediator taught us how to write each obligation clearly so no one could later claim a misremembered favor. Not every step was easy. Pride and guilt wrestled with each of us. Some evenings I sat alone and repeated the worry. Had I been too late? Had my silence for so many years permitted this to happen? Then, I would look at the calendar and the logged calls and remind myself that action matters more than perfect timing. We kept lists and made space for practical care. Slowly, these acted like stitches. Each deposit, each logged call, counted. I began to sleep a little easier. Neighbors nodded at me on the sidewalk and I felt less alone. Dignity is a quiet insistence, not a shout. If there is a lesson I hope you carry, it is simple and stubborn. Keep your name sacred. Ask for paper. Ask for dates. Bring witnesses when conversations matter. Do not let later become a trap. Here are practical steps I learned the hard way. First, when someone says they'll handle things for you, ask what that means in writing. Second, if you are asked to sign or to allow someone to act on your behalf, insist on seeing the documents ahead of time. Third, ask for a neutral witness, mediator, a friend, someone who will keep the conversation honest. Fourth, set reassessment dates. A 3-month check-in can save misunderstanding from becoming habit. There will be social costs. People will call you stubborn. They might suggest you be grateful and quiet. Some will withdraw. Others will rally. Choose dignity over easy comfort. You are not being difficult. You are choosing to be visible. Keep your rituals. Keep your kettle and your morning cup. Keep your key on the little dish. Those small acts remind you that your life is yours. Here are a few phrases you can keep in your back pocket when things feel hurried. Please send that to me in writing. Can we put a date on that decision? And would you mind waiting for me to call my lawyer before we proceed? These are polite and practical. They slow the rush and return a voice to the person most affected. If someone tells you it's too dramatic to ask for time and paper, remember that drama is often the price of bypassing respect. People will call you stubborn because making fairness stick requires more effort than smoothing over. Be prepared for that. It doesn't mean you're unkind. It means you are demanding to be seen. Teach your children the value of consent in small ways. Show them how to ask for permission offhand before borrowing a car, before moving a box labeled sentimental. Those tiny lessons accumulate into a culture of care that keeps relatives from making choices for one another without conversation. For example, if a relative says they will handle the closing, ask, "Can you send the closing documents to me 48 hours before the signing?" If someone says, "It's easier this way," reply, "Easier for whom? Let's put it on the calendar and talk it through." Keep sentences short. Ask for receipts for any expenses, and ask that major choices be placed on a shared calendar. If the person seems impatient, name it kindly. "I hear the urgency. I also need time to process this." Also, name the urgency and ask for help from a neutral person to keep tempers calm and fair always. Practice saying, "I need a copy of that, please," or "Let's pause and revisit this on Friday." These are sentences that buy you time and respect. Use them. Most of all, be gentle with yourself. Taking a stand can be lonely at first. It's fine to have regrets, but turn regret into action request. The documents. Call the mediator. Make the list. Reach out to neighbors you trust. Use community resources. You are not asking for hostility. You are asking for clarity. We weren't perfect, but we were trying. People said what neighbors rarely say out loud. After the hard work, voices began to change. Women at church spoke up in other kitchens about asking for clear boundaries. A neighbor told me she'd finally asked her son to put agreements on paper. An online note came from a woman in another town who said she'd paused a sale after reading about what I did. Those small stories felt like company. Neighbors dropped off meals and practical help. One left a note. "Good on you for asking. My mother needed that too." Another sent a message saying her family had set a calendar. It was a spare, unexpected kind of consolation that my little stand nudged others toward clarity. And then, a message arrived from a stranger. She wrote she had nearly signed something that would have closed on her mother's house. After reading about my calendar and my steps, she'd asked for time and counsel. "I thought I was being rude," she said, "but you gave me permission to ask for time." I cried reading it. The note felt like a small chorus joining our kitchen table. A neighbor wrote, "I used your steps to ask my son for a 30-day pause before he listed my house. It saved me." Another woman said she took her mother's mail back into her own name after following our checklist. Those notes felt like small rewards for stubborn clarity. I said thank you to each person. A message arrived that made me cry. We still fold paper boats on rainy afternoons. Time moved the house back toward ordinary. The calendar stayed on the fridge. Sunday dinners resumed with a new preface. "Do we need to check the date on the calendar?" We laughed about it, and sometimes we sighed. The teacup returned to its spot after a brief exile. The key stayed on the dish. I took slow walks again, and chatted with neighbors. The children still ran through the yard and tracked mud into the kitchen. We taped little repairs on the paper boats when they leaked. Those small acts of patching felt like the work of mending trust hands, doing practical things to prove intention. Damp earth and coffee linger, and apples from the tree get tucked into pies on the sill. It wasn't that everything was fixed. There are still moments where old habits tug at the edges, but there is also a new habit of asking, of putting plans on paper, of pausing. The house is quieter now because the questions no longer float unasked. They sit written where anyone can see them. When dusk stretches across the yard, the porch light hums, and the radio plays an old hymn, and I feel content enough to sleep. The porch light hummed the same tune. If this story touched you, tell me what you would have done in the comments below. Subscribe and share with someone who needs a little courage to ask for clarity. Your words give others permission to protect their dignity. Next time, I'll tell you about the letter I found in the attic, an old note that made us see a summer differently. Thank you for being here with me. Your voice matters. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to neighbors and the quiet hands that helped us mend. See you soon. Goodbye.